Ava Johnson drove through the quiet streets of the small suburban town, feeling the weight of her responsibilities on her shoulders. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, and the air was warm but crisp like it always was on mornings like this. She was thinking about the cases she had to review once she arrived at the office and how she would manage the hectic schedule ahead when suddenly she saw the flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Eva sighed quietly. She had been pulled over many times in her life for minor violations. It was always the same routine, and it was usually nothing to worry about. But still the anxiety crept in every time she pulled over. The nerves lingered just under the surface. It wasn't the traffic violation itself that caused the unease, it was the way she was often treated because of the color of her skin. She rolled down her window as the officer approached, his heavy boots tapping the pavement with each step. His face was hard and serious, the kind of face that made you feel like you were already guilty of something even before he spoke. Ava kept her expression neutral but polite as she handed him her license and registration. Her fingers brushed against the cool leather of her purse. As she retrieved the documents, she tried to breathe steadily, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was sizing her up, that his eyes lingered on her face just a little longer than necessary. The officer took the documents without saying a word and walked back to his patrol car. Ava glanced around the quiet street, wondering if she could just get this over with and move on. Her mind kept drifting back to the weight of the cases waiting for her on her desk, the decisions she had to make, the lives she had to impact. And yet here she was caught in this small moment with a cop who seemed to treat her like she was a criminal without cause. Minutes passed before the officer returned to her window, his expression still stern, but now with a small frown tugging at the corner of his lips. He held up a ticket in his hand. The violation was minor, a missed stop sign or a slight turn without signaling, but the fine was real, and the words on the paper seemed too harsh for what had just happened. "You were speeding through that intersection," the officer said, his voice tight. "This ticket is for a failure to signal and failure to yield when making that turn. I'm issuing you a fine." Eva blinked in disbelief. It wasn't true she hadn't sped or failed to signal, but she didn't argue. She knew better than to challenge the officer in that moment, not with his tone or the way he was looking at her. Something told her it wasn't worth the fight. Something told her that if she pushed back just a little too hard, she might be viewed as the problem. "Okay," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I'll take care of it." The officer handed her the ticket and walked back to his car without another word. Ava stayed still for a moment, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly as she watched him drive off down the street. She glanced at the ticket again, the weight of it pressing against her palm. She wasn't angry, she was just tired of being judged, tired of the constant small moments where she was made to feel like she didn't belong in places where she had every right to be. Ava arrived at the courthouse a few weeks later, her steps deliberate but calm as she walked through the stone archway that led into the building. The air inside was cool, and the sound of echoing footsteps filled the vast hallways. She glanced around briefly, spotting familiar faces of clerks and other legal professionals. There was a slight nervousness, but it wasn't because she feared the court process. She had been in these rooms countless times before. No, it was because she knew what was coming. The same courthouse, the same faces, but this time the roles had been reversed. She would be the one defending herself, not someone else. As she entered the courtroom, the first thing that caught her attention was Judge Harrison, sitting high on his bench with his usual stern expression. He was an older man with graying hair and a demeanor that commanded respect, though Ava knew that respect was often earned, not just granted because of age or title. Judge Harrison had a reputation in the town. He was swift in his rulings and rarely showed leniency. Ava had seen him hand down harsh sentences before, especially when it came to those who didn't seem to fit his ideal image of a responsible citizen. She knew from experience how people like her were often treated in his courtroom, and her heart sank slightly at the thought of being just another number in his eyes. Ava took a seat in the front row, trying to remain composed despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. The room filled quickly, and the sounds of whispers and rustling papers surrounded her. She glanced over at the opposing side. The officer who had issued the ticket, Officer Stevens was sitting at the prosecution's table with his arms folded. He looked confident, almost smug, as if he already knew the outcome of this hearing. Ava's gaze stayed on him for a moment longer than she intended, and she could see the slight shift in his posture when their eyes met. His confidence seemed to waver just a little, and Ava couldn't help but wonder if he recognized her as more than just a woman contesting a ticket. The hearing began, and Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension in the room. "Ms. Johnson, you're here today to contest a traffic violation for failure to signal and failure to yield. How do you plead?" Ava stood up, her posture straight, her mind sharp. "I respectfully contest the charges, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. The judge looked at her with a slight frown, clearly unimpressed by her calm demeanor. He gestured to Officer Stevens. "Officer Stevens, please present your case." The officer stood, cleared his throat, and proceeded with the familiar, monotonous recount of the traffic stop. He painted the picture of a reckless driver who had disregarded the law despite the minor nature of the violation. Ava listened carefully, knowing the officer's story didn't match what had actually happened. He exaggerated the facts, adding more weight to the situation than it deserved. The room seemed to hang on his every word as though his version of events was the gospel truth. Ava's jaw tightened, but she remained composed, reminding herself that she had the facts on her side. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her. "And do you have any counter-arguments, Ms. Johnson?" Ava took a breath before speaking. "Your Honor, I was neither speeding nor failing to signal. I followed the law as I always do, and the officer's account is not an accurate reflection of what transpired. I simply made a right turn at a stop sign, and my signal was on. This ticket was issued without merit, and I respectfully ask that it be dismissed." The judge didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he turned to Officer Stevens, who now looked even more certain of his stance. Ava could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her, the eyes of everyone in the room seemingly on her, as if this was more than just a simple traffic dispute. "Very well," Judge Harrison said after a long pause, his voice firm. "I will deliberate, but I have no doubt this violation occurred." Ava's heart sank. She had prepared for the worst, but hearing it spoken aloud felt different. This wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about the unfair treatment she had come to expect, the assumption that her presence here, in this courtroom, meant she was in the wrong. The judge wasn't listening, and she was starting to feel that the system would never be on her side. As the judge continued, Ava could only think one thing. This wasn't going to be easy, and she was about to learn just how far she would have to go to make her voice heard in this system. The days following the courtroom hearing were tense for Ava. She had expected to face some resistance, but she hadn't anticipated the weight of Judge Harrison's dismissal. It wasn't just the fine she was upset about. It was the way her voice had been silenced in that courtroom. The look in the judge's eyes, the way Officer Stevens had spoken with such confidence, and the unsettling feeling that she was being judged not for her actions, but for who she was, it all left her with a bitter taste. Back at her office, Ava buried herself in work. Her desk was covered in case files, paperwork for the upcoming trials, and the kind of legal jargon that would make anyone's head spin. But even as she read through the material in front of her, her mind kept wandering back to that moment in the courtroom. The way she had been dismissed, ignored, and misunderstood. She wasn't just another citizen challenging a fine. She was the district attorney, and she had been reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience in that room. It wasn't long before the whispers started. The courthouse had always been a place where gossip flowed as freely as coffee in the break room, but now people were starting to take notice of her case. Ava overheard murmurs in the hallway as she passed by the clerk's office. Lawyers she barely knew gave her polite nods, their eyes darting away as soon as they met hers. It was obvious that her case had become more than just a simple traffic violation. It had become a symbol, one that people were either rallying behind or avoiding, unsure of how to engage with her. Ava wasn't naive. She knew how the system worked, how power dynamics played out in every courtroom. But it didn't make it any easier to stomach. She had risen to the position of district attorney not by playing it safe or keeping her head down. She had worked tirelessly, proving herself time and again. Yet here she was, facing the same kind of discrimination that had plagued her for years, this time with the added insult of being treated as if she didn't belong in her own courtroom. The breaking point came when she ran into Liam a younger attorney who worked in the district attorney's office. He looked at her with wide eyes, clearly stunned by the news of her case. He had no idea she was the same Ava Johnson who sat at the top of the legal food chain in their district. He had heard about the trial, but he hadn't made the connection until now. You're the district attorney? William asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and admiration. Ava nodded, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. She had expected this reaction from someone like him. It wasn't that she didn't want people to know who she was. It was that she wanted to control when and how they learned about her position. I didn't want to say anything during the trial, Ava explained, but I'm the one who oversees all criminal cases in this district. I've worked hard to get where I am. William seemed taken aback by the revelation, and for a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. He looked at her with a mix of awe and curiosity, but there was also an underlying tension in the air. He had seen how the judge and the officer treated her, and now, knowing who she really was, it made the entire incident feel different. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing just how much Ava's identity played into her treatment that day. That explains a lot, Liam said slowly, his voice quieter now. But why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you tell them who you were? Ava shrugged, trying to shake off the weight of the question. Sometimes, it's better to let people show their true colors. The moment I step into that courtroom, I want to be judged by my actions, not my title. Liam nodded, his expression one of understanding, though it was clear he was still processing the weight of the situation. Ava's thoughts began to race. She had always believed in the power of fairness, the idea that the law should apply equally to everyone, no matter their background or position. But now, seeing how her position had influenced the way people perceived her, she felt the ground shift beneath her. She wasn't just challenging a simple traffic fine anymore, she was challenging the entire system. I'm going to take this further, Ava said, her voice steady. This isn't just about the ticket. It's about showing that people like me, no matter what role we hold, deserve to be treated with respect. Liam gave her an encouraging nod, his eyes showing a mix of admiration and concern. Be careful, Ava. People won't like this. Ava's jaw tightened, but her resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. If she had to shake the system to its core to make it right, she would. The fight had only just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. Ava knew that confronting Judge Harrison directly could backfire, but the frustration had built up to a point where she felt compelled to take action. She couldn't just let the system continue on as if nothing had happened, especially after everything she had seen and felt in that courtroom. The slight dismissal in the judge's eyes, the way Officer Stevens had acted as if he held all the power. It was clear to her that she wasn't being judged on the merits of her case, but on something deeper, something unspoken. It was time to address it head-on. The request for a private meeting with Judge Harrison was not something she took lightly. She knew the weight that her presence would carry in that room, and she wasn't sure what to expect. A part of her wondered if he would even agree to meet with her at all. But then again, her role as the district attorney meant that she held a certain sway in this town, perhaps more than she realized. When she received the confirmation of the meeting, it felt both like a victory and a heavy burden. The day of the meeting, Ava entered the judge's chambers with a calm, measured step. The office was lined with bookshelves and papers, the scent of old wood mixing with the faint smell of leather-bound legal texts. Judge Harrison was already seated behind his large wooden desk, the formality of his demeanor still intact. He looked up as she entered, his brow furrowing slightly, though his eyes betrayed nothing. Ms. Johnson, he said with a nod, gesturing to the seat across from him. I'm assuming this is regarding the hearing last week. Ava sat down, meeting his gaze directly, not allowing any hint of discomfort to show. Yes, Your Honor. I wanted to speak with you about what happened in court, she began. Her voice was steady, though she could feel the weight of the conversation bearing down on her. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. I'm sure the fine was an inconvenience, but we all know how these things go. It's standard procedure. Ava paused, taking a breath. She needed to be careful, measured in her words. With all due respect, Judge, It wasn't just about the fine. It was the way the case was handled, the way I was treated, the assumptions that were made. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he regarded her carefully. "I'm not sure I follow," he said, his voice cool. "You contested a violation. It happens every day." Ava exhaled slowly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "It wasn't just a violation, Your Honor. It was the way I was treated like just another defendant in the system, without any consideration for who I am or what I represent. You didn't listen to my side of the story, and Officer Stevens, he didn't either." The silence in the room was thick, the only sound the soft hum of the courthouse outside. Ava continued, her tone more firm now. "I'm not just a citizen contesting a fine. I'm the district attorney responsible for ensuring fairness in this district. I've worked my entire career to earn that title, and yet in your courtroom, I was treated like I didn't belong there, like my presence wasn't worth listening to." Judge Harrison's expression softened just slightly, though it was impossible to tell if he was truly understanding her point. "I didn't mean to undermine you, Ms. Johnson," he said, though there was a tinge of defensiveness in his voice. "The law is the law, and I was simply following procedure." Ava felt a sharp pang of frustration, but she pushed it down, her voice calm and even. "It's not just about procedure, Judge. It's about understanding the system and the people it serves. People like me who are constantly fighting to be heard, to be seen as equals, not just as a face in a crowd. That's something I want you to consider next time you sit on that bench." There was a long pause as Judge Harrison studied her. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Ava knew she had said everything she needed to. She had placed a mirror in front of him, forcing him to see not just her, but everything that had led to this moment. Finally, the judge sighed, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "I hear you, Ms. Johnson," he said quietly, "and I will do better." Ava nodded, standing up to leave. "I'm holding you to that, Your Honor." As she exited his office, Ava felt a strange sense of relief mixed with uncertainty. She had said what needed to be said, but the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. She had confronted the judge, but she knew that real change would take more than one conversation. It would take persistence, and it would take time. Still, for the first time since that day in the courtroom, Ava felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. The following days after her meeting with Judge Harrison felt like a subtle shift had taken place, though Ava wasn't sure how far the ripples would extend. She had made her point, but she knew that change didn't happen overnight, especially not in a town where traditions and power dynamics were so deeply ingrained. Still, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction that accompanied the lingering weight of her words. Ava hadn't expected instant results, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. Back in her office, Ava threw herself into her work once again. The stack of case files on her desk seemed never-ending, but it was a distraction, a way to keep her mind focused. She worked through lunch, reviewing evidence and preparing for the next big trial. Even as she did, her mind wandered back to the courtroom, to that moment with Judge Harrison. She couldn't help but replay the conversation in her head, wondering if it had truly made an impact. But she wasn't the only one thinking about what had transpired. Word spread fast in the legal community, and soon, Ava began to receive a series of unexpected messages. It started with a phone call from Liam, the young attorney who had first expressed his disbelief at her being the district attorney. He had seen her at her lowest, so to speak, but now he was genuinely intrigued by her resolve. His voice on the other end of the line was full of admiration. "I've been thinking about what you said, Ava," he told her. "I didn't realize how deep the issues ran until you pointed them out. You're right. There's something broken in the system, and it's not just the small things, it's the way we all look the other way." Ava couldn't help but smile at his words. It felt good to know that her actions were making an impact, even if it was on just one person. "Thanks, Liam," she replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "I'm glad it's resonating. Change isn't easy, but it has to start somewhere." As the day wore on, more calls came through. Colleagues who had heard about the meeting with Judge Harrison, all offering their support. There was a mix of genuine encouragement and cautious optimism. Some were hesitant to take sides, but others, like Rachel a fellow DA who had been in the office for years, were more vocal about their approval. I respect what you're doing, Ava, Rachel said over the phone. It's about time someone spoke up. The system isn't as fair as it claims to be, and sometimes the people who need to see that the most are the ones who hold the most power. Keep pushing. Her words gave Ava a renewed sense of purpose. The fact that there were others who understood and shared her frustrations made the battle feel a little less isolating. But even with the support, Ava couldn't ignore the quiet whispers she still felt in the hallways, the judgment that came from the older generation of lawyers and the more traditional members of the community. They hadn't forgotten the traffic hearing, and they certainly hadn't forgotten who she was. Ava was in her office one afternoon, sifting through the usual paperwork, when she received a call from Officer Stevens himself. The sound of his voice was sharp, and Ava could hear the tension in the background. "Ms. Johnson," he said curtly, "there's something you need to know. The judge has reconsidered the case. After reviewing your complaint and discussing the matter with the higher-ups, he's decided to reverse the fine and issue an official apology." Ava blinked in surprise, unsure of how to react. This wasn't what she had expected. She had made peace with the possibility that the system wouldn't shift overnight, but this was a small victory, a crack in the armor. "Thank you, Officer Stevens," she said carefully, her tone guarded but grateful. "I appreciate that." He muttered a short, tense response before hanging up. Ava sat in silence for a moment, digesting the news. A part of her felt vindicated. This was proof that the system could be swayed, that a challenge could make a difference. But another part of her knew that the fight wasn't over. This victory was a small one, a personal one. There was still a long road ahead to address the deeper, structural issues in the system. Still, Ava couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. She had faced opposition, but she had made a crack in the wall. The next steps were uncertain, but Ava was no longer afraid to keep pushing. She had proven to herself that her voice mattered, and now it was time to keep making it heard. The courthouse might have been silent that day in the courtroom, but it wouldn't be silent for long. Ava's victory, though small, marked a pivotal moment in her journey. The reversal of the fine and the apology from Judge Harrison were more than just formalities. They were a testament to her ability to make her voice heard, even in a system that often silenced people like her. But Ava knew that this wasn't the end. It was a spark, and sparks have the potential to ignite something bigger. Her determination had gained momentum, and now she could sense a change coming, one that would require more than just challenging one judge. With the case behind her, Ava began to turn her attention toward the broader issues at play. She started to focus on reforming some of the systemic problems that had fueled her frustration in the first place. It wasn't enough to simply make a statement in one courtroom. She needed to push for lasting change. She began drafting a proposal for community outreach programs aimed at educating citizens about their rights and encouraging transparency between law enforcement and the legal system. It was an ambitious plan, one that would take time to implement, but Ava felt the urgency. Her time as district attorney had shown her the deep divisions in the community, the disparities that too often went unchallenged. It was time for something more. One evening while working late, Ava received an unexpected phone call from Rachel, her colleague who had been so supportive of her efforts. Rachel's voice was filled with excitement and a hint of disbelief. "Ava, you won't believe this," Rachel began. "There's been a meeting scheduled by the mayor's office. They're inviting you to speak about the work you've been doing, the changes you're pushing for. They're actually considering taking some of your proposals seriously." Ava felt a mix of disbelief and caution. She had always known that real change would be difficult, and she wasn't sure if the mayor's office was truly ready to engage in the kind of reforms she had in mind. Still, the opportunity was too significant to pass up. It was a chance to put her ideas into action, to get the support she needed to take her initiatives to the next level. "I'll take the meeting," Ava replied, her voice steady. "But I need to know what they're really after. I won't waste time on half measures." The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and as the day drew closer, Ava prepared herself thoroughly. She reviewed every aspect of her proposal, anticipating potential objections and preparing counterarguments. She knew that the powers that be wouldn't just hand her what she wanted. She would need to push, to show them that the system needed to change for everyone, not just the ones who already held power. When the day arrived, Ava walked into the mayor's office with a sense of calm purpose. The room was full of the city's most influential figures, law enforcement officials, other lawyers, and a few community leaders who had long held sway in local politics. The atmosphere was tense, with an air of skepticism lingering in the room. Eva stood at the front, her proposal in hand, and began her presentation. As she spoke, her voice resonated with confidence. She laid out her vision for a more transparent and equitable system, one where the voices of those who had been historically ignored were finally given space. She spoke about the need for stronger community engagement, for better training within law enforcement, and for an overhaul of certain outdated policies. She didn't mince words. She was clear about the obstacles ahead, but also about the potential for real transformation. The room was quiet when she finished, and for a moment, it seemed like no one was willing to speak. Ava could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Would they reject her ideas? Would they see her as just another idealist trying to challenge the system? Then, to her surprise, it was the mayor himself who broke the silence. "You've got guts, Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice steady but laced with respect. "And you've got a point. These are issues that have been neglected for too long. I can't promise you everything, but I can promise we'll take this seriously." Ava allowed herself a small, relieved smile. It wasn't a victory just yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The mayor wasn't dismissing her outright. He was listening. And for the first time, Eva felt that her work, her relentless pursuit of fairness and justice, might finally be gaining the traction it deserved. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about making a lasting difference in her community. As she left the mayor's office, a sense of optimism washed over her. She still had much work to do, but the first crack in the wall had been made. Change was possible, and Ava was more determined than ever to be the one to lead it. The weeks following Ava's meeting with the mayor were a whirlwind of activity. News of her proposal began to circulate, and while there was some hesitation within certain political circles, there was also a growing sense of intrigue. Her vision for a more transparent, inclusive legal system had struck a chord with several community leaders, and the mayor's office, though cautious, began to show signs of serious interest. But Ava knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. As part of the proposal's implementation, Ava was asked to host a series of public forums to discuss the issues of legal reform, community engagement, and police accountability. These forums would allow her to present her ideas directly to the citizens who were most affected by the system. The idea was to create a dialogue between law enforcement, the legal system, and the communities they served, something that had been sorely lacking for far too long. Ava wasn't naive about the challenges she would face. These conversations would be uncomfortable, and she would undoubtedly encounter resistance. But the stakes were high, and Ava was ready to tackle whatever came her way. The first public forum was held in a local community center, packed with residents who had gathered to voice their concerns and ask questions. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Ava had been nervous before stepping onto the stage, but as soon as she saw the faces in the crowd, some hopeful, some skeptical, she knew that her efforts had been worth it. She was not just talking to a room full of strangers. She was talking to people whose lives were affected by the very systems she sought to change. As she began her presentation, Ava could feel the eyes of the room on her, each individual with their own story, their own struggles. She spoke about the need for greater accountability, how the legal system often failed to protect those who needed it most, and how the lines between law enforcement and the community needed to be redrawn. Eva addressed the importance of diversifying the voices in leadership roles, emphasizing how critical it was for people of all backgrounds to be represented in decisions that impacted their lives. The crowd listened intently, but the tension was undeniable. When she finished, the questions started coming fast and furious. Some were supportive, eager to hear more about how the reforms would work. Others, however, were more skeptical. One woman, an older resident who had lived in the city for decades, stood up and said, "You talk about change. Well, we've heard it all before. You're a district attorney. What makes you think you can fix this system? The system is broken from the inside, and people like me have been living in it for years." Ava took a deep breath, sensing that the real test was about to begin. "I understand your frustration," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to promise you that it will be easy or quick, but I've seen the cracks in the system, and I know we can make it better. It's not about changing everything overnight, but it is about starting the conversation and making sure that people are heard. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to join me in creating something better for all of us." There was a long pause before the woman sat down, and Ava could see that her words had resonated, even if only slightly. But the shift in the room was subtle. Ava had given them something to think about, a chance to believe that change was possible, even if it wasn't going to happen in the way they might have imagined. As the forum continued, Ava was met with more tough questions and varying opinions. Some attendees felt that the legal system had become too entrenched to ever be reformed. Others wanted immediate action, demanding answers about how Ava planned to implement the changes she was proposing. Ava answered each question with the same steady resolve, knowing that the road ahead was going to be filled with challenges, but also knowing that this was the kind of discourse the community needed to have. By the end of the evening, Ava was exhausted, her throat sore from the constant talking, but there was a quiet sense of accomplishment that lingered. The first forum had been a success, not because everyone agreed with her, but because the conversation had started. For Ava, that was the most important part. She hadn't just been heard. She had helped people see that they could demand more from their leaders, that they had a role to play in shaping the future of the community. As she walked out of the community center that evening, Ava's mind raced with the conversations she had had, the faces she had seen, and the work that still lay ahead. She had faced resistance, but she had also found allies. People who, like her, wanted to see the system change. It was a long road ahead, but Ava was more determined than ever to continue fighting for the future she knew was possible. The conversations had begun, and now there was no turning back. Ava woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The previous night's forum had left her exhausted, but it had also solidified her belief that change was not just possible, it was essential. The conversation she had started would not be easy, but they had the power to transform the city, and she was ready to lead that transformation. The forums were just the beginning. As the weeks went on, the momentum continued to build. More residents, activists, and even law enforcement officers began to attend the meetings, eager to understand the issues at hand and discuss potential solutions. Some came with doubts, others with ideas, but every meeting ended with more clarity, more commitment to a collective effort for change. The message was clear. Ava wasn't just a lone voice in a broken system. She was a catalyst, gathering people to move forward together. One of the most surprising shifts came from within the legal community itself. Ava had expected some resistance from her colleagues, especially from those who were deeply entrenched in the old ways of doing things. But she found that more and more were willing to listen, to think critically about their role in perpetuating a system that often overlooked the most vulnerable. It wasn't just about punishing those who broke the law. It was about understanding why they did, about addressing the roots of crime and inequality. Slowly, but surely, Ava began to see it. Even the toughest critics were starting to see the world through a different lens. Then came the next big moment, a meeting with the city council. The mayor had kept his promise, and his office had scheduled a formal discussion about the reforms Ava had proposed. This meeting was going to be a major turning point. If she could win the support of the council, Ava knew that the next phase of her work would be within reach. The city council chambers were packed with reporters, activists, and a few familiar faces, friends and colleagues who had supported her all along. Ava stood at the front, her proposal in hand, as she prepared to speak before a room filled with some of the most powerful people in the city. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This was the culmination of months of hard work, of putting her ideas into the world and hoping they would take root. She took a deep breath and began, her voice steady and confident. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I stand before you not just as the district attorney of this city, but as someone who believes in the potential for change. We all know that the system isn't perfect, that it's been flawed for far too long. But what I've seen in the past months in the forums, in the conversations I've had, is that we are ready for something better. We are ready to rebuild trust, to address the systemic issues that have left so many behind. Ava spoke with passion, laying out her vision for a city where justice wasn't just a word, it was a practice. She outlined how the legal system could evolve to be more compassionate, to focus on rehabilitation instead of punishment, and how critical it was for law enforcement to be held to the highest standards of accountability. She spoke of restorative justice, of investing in education and community programs that could prevent crime from happening in the first place. The council members listened, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging looks that Ava couldn't read. But as she finished, she felt the weight of the room shift. There was no immediate applause, no overwhelming show of support, but the silence was different now. It wasn't hostile, it was contemplative. And for Ava, that was progress. After her speech, a few council members asked questions, some skeptical, others genuinely curious. The back and forth was tense but constructive. Ava's answers were thoughtful and precise, and as the meeting progressed, it became clear that her proposal had gained traction. By the end of the session, the council had voted to move forward with her recommendations, albeit with some adjustments. It was a victory, not a complete win, but it was a step in the right direction. Walking out of the council chambers, Ava felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The road ahead was still long, and there were many more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that the changes she had envisioned were becoming a reality. The city was beginning to listen. It was starting to understand that real justice wasn't just about laws and rules. It was about fairness, compassion, and giving people a chance to be heard. And Ava, in her quiet determination, had sparked that movement. The fight was far from over, but Ava knew one thing for sure. The system would never be the same again.